The ceasefire between Iran and the United States has ceased, and thus begins the saga of a potential constitutional crisis in the United States. Yes, yesterday, a series of events began the ceasefire's unraveling. The United States had announced Project Freedom the day before, designed to evacuate vessels trapped inside the Strait of Hormuz. Then there was an explosion on a South Korean-operated vessel. Plus, we had Trump announce that the United States had shot down 7 speedboats in the area after they apparently presented a threat to part of the U.S. fleet. CENTCOM instead said it was 6 boats. It is also unclear at the moment whether Trump used a poor choice of words, or if Iran has some secret technology that allows their fast boats to be shot down rather than simply sunk. He also threatened to blow Iran off the face of the earth. Then Iran fired 12 ballistic missiles, 3 cruise missiles, and 4 one-way attack drones at the United Arab Emirates. Why the UAE? Maybe it is just nearby. Maybe Iran is upset that the UAE has left OPEC. Who knows? One interesting note is that it appears that Israel helped shoot down Iran's missiles. This matters because one explanation for the October 7th attack was to make a military alliance between Israel and its Arab neighbors infeasible. Yet now they are working together. Keep an eye on what happens with Saudi Arabia in this space, because that is the big kingdom on the block. Meanwhile, Iranian state media has also claimed to have struck a U.S. frigate. This would be the most interesting development of the war thus far, seeing as the United States currently operates 0 frigates. What you are looking at now is a rendering of the constellation, still under construction. Either way, I've enjoyed watching news programs ask, "Is the ceasefire over?" Well, here is some hard-hitting analysis that only lines on maps can deliver. The word is ceasefire. It is actually a compound word consisting of cease, meaning to end, and fire, meaning to go boom. Seeing as the booming has recommenced, yes, I do believe that the ceasefire is over. That, of course, assumes that a ceasefire was ever in place at all. Israel was still targeting Hezbollah in Lebanon, and one of the terms of the ceasefire was that Iran would reopen the strait. So, no matter which side of the geopolitical divide you are on, the terms of the ceasefire were not being fulfilled. A rare case where the passive voice is deliberate, because I do not want to say who was violating it. Anyway, there are 2 things that I want to do with the remainder of today's video. 1, discuss why Project Freedom is not going to work as constructed, and 2, the potential for a constitutional crisis, and why there is going to be plenty more weirdness about whether the ceasefire persists. Let's start with Project Freedom. And to summarize what I'm about to say in this section, what we are looking at is another half measure, when what we really need is to go big or go home. What this is not is a traditional escort mission, where major US vessels sail in a convoy to protect friendly commercial vessels, as was implemented during the Iran-Iraq War. That would at least have some chance of working, though for reasons we will explain in a second, I understand why the United States is not pursuing that method. Rather, it appears that CENTCOM is trying to institutionalize a procedure to extract vessels from the Persian Gulf, which would at least allow them to deliver what is on board, and also increase the supply of transport vessels for the rest of the global market. That mostly means guiding them through the strait. CENTCOM has released few details on what that means. Part of it, I am sure, is ensuring that the US Navy is aware of the intended passage and can provide the support that it is willing to give. Part of it is likely coordinating with the US Navy on a trajectory that has recently been scanned and cleared of mines. Part of it may be to provide tangible help if a threat develops, albeit through drones or maybe a helicopter. But the biggest part of it is a prayer that the shipping companies will go for the scheme, given that active defense is minimal. I would have more faith in their safety if the heavy metal were right next to them, but the Navy appears uninterested in chaperoning, presumably because it is too dangerous. If it is too dangerous for the Navy, What does that say about the risk to civilian vessels? Meanwhile, Iran has all the incentive to attack those vessels. As long as the United States is blockading the strait for vessels connected to Iranian ports, Iran has little stake in the peace as constructed. We will have to do a deeper dive on this point at a later date, but it is not a mystery as to how you get a deal to be enforceable. You need both sides to have a vested interest in upholding it, meaning that it is better than the alternative of going back to war. As it stands, this is not better for Iran than reverting back to fighting. Speaking of fighting, the full measure solution for the United States is to properly degrade Iranian capacity along the coastline, something that was just getting underway at the time of the ceasefire. Fast forward 3 weeks, and any work there is likely undone. Now, I still think that this task is militarily feasible for the United States, but it requires a commitment, which means costs, time, and risks. So the deeper question then becomes why the United States is not investing those costs, spending that time, and assuming those risks. Well, I am sure that you have heard plenty of answers to that puzzle recently, but let's focus on the one that has come into focus over the last 2 weeks. Rewind to 1973. Vietnam was not going well. Congress had grown frustrated that the United States spent the last decade fighting a war that the legislative body had yet to declare. Thus, the War Powers Resolution attempted to rein in executive power, obligating the president to obtain congressional approval within 60 days of the start of a conflict. Nixon vetoed the resolution as an unconstitutional power grab by Congress, but the House and the Senate had more than the 2/3 supermajority to override the president. It became law. Since then, presidents have rejected the War Powers Resolution still as an unconstitutional breach of the delegation of control over the military to the executive. Presidents have nonetheless paid lip service to the resolution, not wanting Congress to put the president's policies up to the Supreme Court. Think of this as a form of lines on laws bargaining. That brings us to the current affair. The Iran war started on February 28th. 60 days, therefore, is April 28th. I am publishing this video on day 67, which not coincidentally marks my 67th consecutive day of publishing a video. According to the War Powers Resolution, the president needed congressional authorization last week. What is the administration's legal opinion on the matter? Hegseth testified in front of Congress last week and came prepared with a legal theory. Yes, 60 days had passed, but it has not been 60 days of active hostilities. The ceasefire essentially stopped the clock as it relates to the War Powers Resolution. This logic also helps explain the administration's reaction to the shooting resuming. Despite the firing no longer being ceased, we are still in a ceasefire, because suggesting otherwise would restart that clock. May 25th would be the new deadline if it came to that. So what happens next? Let's suppose that the firing continues throughout that period. Or perhaps there are a handful of days where the parties observe a de facto ceasefire. But either way, by no later than June, 60 days of actual fighting have passed. What then? As a starting point, I do not imagine that the Trump administration will care. In fact, I was surprised that Hegseth testified as he did. I would have guessed beforehand that the administration would claim that the War Powers Resolution only covers 60 days of continuous hostilities. So if you go 59 days, then observe a ceasefire, and then the war restarts, it would be another 60 days before our 60-day limit kicks in. Instead, Trump could adopt the same theory that the Obama administration presented for Libya. The War Powers Resolution does not apply here because there are no boots on the ground, and therefore the risk to U.S. service personnel is minimal. However, Obama also claimed that the United States was not the primary combatant, but rather was in a support role for Libyan rebels, something that Trump cannot claim because the United States put the cart before the horse there. In terms of direct congressional intervention, I am not expecting much here. Both chambers remain under Republican control, and while the war has been incredibly unpopular, we still have not seen a significant number of breaks from the administration by congressional Republicans. That might change as the November midterms draw near and the polling numbers have more bite, but that remains a hypothetical for now. Here is the thing, though. Existing laws do not need continuous approval in Washington for them to still be binding. Continuing past 60 days is still illegal under the War Powers Resolution, regardless of whether Congress is actively enforcing it. Anyone harmed by the continued fighting has standing, which is basically everyone because of the effect on higher gas prices. Thus, we may see the Supreme Court take up a case on the War Powers Resolution, and we will find out once and for all whether it is constitutional. I will remind you now that I am not a lawyer, but as a political scientist, I will also remind you that the Supreme Court is a political body, and legal theories matter less than the political disposition of the court. As it stands, 6 of the 9 justices lean conservative, but a subset of them often split from the Trump administration on a variety of adventurous policies. That is my way of saying that I do not know which way the court would break. If the court throws out the War Powers Resolution, then the rest that we are about to walk through is irrelevant. The best that the war's detractors could hope for is help following a blue wave in November's midterm elections. If the court instead upholds the War Powers Resolution, then this is where things start to get spicy. The Trump administration would then have to decide whether to comply. Note that the law gives the president 30 days to wrap up the conflict without authorization. Presumably, the Supreme Court would extend that to whenever the ruling is issued, because the point of the 30-day window is to tie up any loose ends. Then you have to factor in how quickly the Supreme Court moved. Now, the court can act rapidly when it feels like it. Think about Bush v. Gore back in 2000. But again, the court is a political actor, and stalling on the case is advantageous because it punts the problem down the line and allows the swing voters to stay out of the fray for longer. It is possible that the issue will then resolve itself, at which point the court need not issue a ruling. The point is, we might very well be looking at the end of the summer or later before any of this gets resolved. Only then could a constitutional crisis erupt, assuming that the Trump administration refuses to comply. The final thing that I will note here is that Trump will have a difficult time continuing to pursue the war if the Supreme Court unambiguously declares the War Powers Resolution constitutional, and Congress does not authorize further action. At that point, congressional midterm elections will be right over the horizon. And while I doubt a veto-proof supermajority will completely shut down the executive, enough Republicans will defect that the White House will be unable to pass basic funding bills without ending the war. You also have the slight problem that the U.S. military swears an oath to the Constitution, not the president. You will also begin to get a number of high-ranking resignations, which will stall any progress in Iran, at the cost of handicapping the U.S. military for a generation. So, what are our takeaway points for today? The ceasefire has ended for now, despite the denials otherwise. The new U.S. effort to bring vessels through the strait will struggle to return traffic back to normal. And there is about to be a much larger fight over the War Powers Resolution. Meanwhile, you can catch up on the rest of all of the crazy things that have happened in the Middle East by watching this playlist. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.
And I can't confirm or deny whether we have kamikaze dolphins, but I can confirm they don't.